thank you for your participation in the last section. And this section now is really about, okay, so what can we do about it? How do we play a role in bringing about peace and justice? And I'm delighted to welcome Elizabeth Jones, who's the Director of Legal Services for the National Assembly for Wales. She's going to give, to start with, a sort of political perspective on this. So I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth now.
Lovely. You can see I'm not a politician, otherwise I'd know how to do this. So hello, croeso bawb, croeso I chi gyd. Welcome to you all, to Tŷ Hywel and to the Senedd today. As Martin has said, this part of the day is about what has been done since the First World War to promote peace and justice in the world, so hopefully leaving you on a slightly more uplifting note. I've been asked to talk in particular about the European Union and also about our own National Assembly for Wales. So I'm going to start with the European Union, and I'm going to talk about it really from a personal perspective. And I'd like to tell you a story. And it's a story about somebody that I used to live next door to. His name is George Hatt, and he lives in Strasbourg in France. And I lived there for 5 years in the next door flat to him and his wife, and they were incredibly kind to me. When I moved out there, I was all on my own. I didn't know anybody. My partner wasn't with me, and it was absolutely lovely to have these really kind people living next door to me. I said Strasbourg was in France, and it was when I lived there. But when George's parents were born, it was part of Germany. Germany had captured it from France in a war before the First World War, the Franco-Prussian War. But by the time that George himself was born in 1925, it was French again. And that was a result of the First World War, a direct result of the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles, as some of you may know from your studies. But by the time that George was 16, it was German again. Nazi Germany annexed Strasbourg and the part of France that Strasbourg is in, which is called Alsace. They didn't just occupy it like they did the rest of France, they actually annexed it. They made it part of Germany because they felt that that was where it belonged historically. And the result of that for George was that he was conscripted into the German army. And that didn't happen to most Frenchmen. I mean, a lot of bad things happened to Frenchmen, and obviously particularly to Jewish Frenchmen. But they didn't, as a whole, get conscripted into the German army. But because people in Alsace, in Strasbourg, were regarded as German, they had to go and fight, whether they believed in it or not. And George certainly didn't. He was pretty lucky. Most of the guys from that part of France were sent to the Eastern Front to fight against the Russians, which was particularly horrible and particularly dangerous. George was sent to patrol the Norwegian coast with the German Navy. You may know that Norway was also effectively occupied by the Nazis, and but spies and resistance fighters used to try and get between the neutral Sweden, Norway, and then into the north of Germany. So he was supposed to be trying to stop that. So it was freezing cold, far from home. He knew that if he did anything wrong, if he deserted, his family would be sent to a camp. And it was less dangerous than the Eastern Front, but it was still dangerous. And at any point, he might be asked to shoot on somebody that he actually agreed with. So pretty horrible. This isn't a story about France is good, Germany is bad. I mean, obviously, Nazi Germany was bad, about as bad as you can get. But ignoring that for the moment, it's not about Germany versus France. And I'm not saying that Strasbourg should be French and the Germans grabbed it. A lot of people who live in Strasbourg actually feel much more German than they do French. The language that they speak, which is called Alsatian, I know it's a bit funny, but that is what it's called, is very like German. Their food is much more like German food than what we would think of as French food, etc., etc. The point I'm making is that when you're in Strasbourg, Europe and the European Union feels completely different, to me anyway, to the way it feels looking at it from a British perspective across the channel to some mainland over there. As you can see from what I've been saying, Strasbourg and the people who live there and the people who live in that whole region have for centuries just been pawns in a power game, a deadly game of war between major European powers, latterly mainly France and Germany, or Prussia before Germany. And that's the whole reason the European Union was set up, to stop that game. It wasn't set up to make people richer. It wasn't set up to promote trade per se. It was set up to stop countries fighting each other by linking them economically, by linking them so closely together economically that it would never again be in their interest to fight each other. It would be stupid. And also in the process of binding them together for trade and economic reasons, getting them talking every week, every month, often every day, about ordinary, boring stuff, you know, like potatoes and what the hygiene conditions in slaughterhouses should be and things like that. Not about big, mega macro politics that tends to get the blood rising. So it just, for me, made me see the European Union in a totally different light. And when I hear discussions about how much it costs, what Britain is getting out of it, whether we're getting more out than we're paying in, I always have in the back of my mind, there's a price for peace. And that's not, I mean, the most important thing is peace, is the protection of people's lives. But war is just incredibly expensive as well. I mean, you'll have all seen that in recent wars that Britain's been involved in. I would rather pay for a gravy train than for a troop train, if the European Union is a gravy train. I'd rather it wasn't a gravy train. I'd rather it was reformed. But if you give me a choice between a gravy train and a troop train, I'll take the gravy train. Thank you very much. And I'll see it as effectively a peace tax. You may not agree with me, but I would ask you, when you're thinking about the European Union in the future, to just think about that, to just think about the fact that it is essentially there. That's its fundamental purpose, to stop people fighting each other. Before turning to the National Assembly for Wales, I should just tell you that George, well, obviously you know he survived because he was my neighbour. He and his wife have been married for over 60 years. They had 4 children. They are the happiest couple I've ever seen, so it's kind of a happy story in the end. And George tells me that he never had to kill anyone. I don't know whether it's true, but that's what he says. Okay, so the National Assembly for Wales, what can we do? What have we done to promote peace and justice? We don't have any powers over the armed forces. We don't have any powers over defence. We don't have any powers in terms of international relations. So what contribution can we make? Well, I think 2 things, really. We are, in my view, a very important part of democracy in the United Kingdom. Bringing government closer to the people is something I feel incredibly passionate about, and that's why I came home from France to Wales 15 years ago to work for the Welsh Government and then the National Assembly. Of course, democracy isn't a complete guarantee of peace. Hitler, Mussolini were both elected in elections that were at least to some extent democratic. But it is a pretty good guarantee. It works in most circumstances. And what it has proved to be particularly good in terms of, I think, is preventing internal unrest and wars and conflicts that arise from that. Now, again, obviously not entirely. We have had, for decades of my life, the conflict in Northern Ireland. Every time you turned on the television when I was growing up, it was somebody shooting somebody or bombing somebody in Northern Ireland. You fortunately haven't lived through that, but you know, it's still not entirely a stable situation. But again, looking at evolution in Northern Ireland, that has brought people together in a way that I would never have thought possible when I was growing up. My parents would never have thought possible. And the Assembly, fortunately, though not having to deal with those kind of sharp, pointed conflicts, is part of that same process. So simply, again, it is basic stuff, isn't it? It's just simple stuff. Getting people together, getting them in the same room, getting them talking, getting them understanding that we're all human beings, whatever our opinions are, is just the most basic element of creating and maintaining peace. And I do think that you can be part of that. The Assembly really wants to hear from people your age what we should be doing. That's why we've recently signed the Young Persons Charter. And one of the promises in that charter, we've promised to let people know what we do as a result of what you say to us, not just to listen and then you never hear again about what happened. So please do tell us, please be part of the conversation about the policies of the Welsh Government, about the way that the Assembly is going about things. Talk to us and we'll talk back to you, I promise.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. It now falls to me to briefly talk about some of the international aspects of what happened after the First World War. I'm going to do this briefly because we were hoping for someone more expert than myself to be doing this section. So, but some of this you'll probably know anyway. Does anybody know, hands up if you do know what the name of the first international organisation that was set up after the First World War was called in to try and achieve greater unity? Okay, just a few of you. This is a useful learning point, perhaps. Who's going to tell me? One of you going to tell me? The League of Nations. That's right. Okay, so there was this organisation called the League of Nations that was established to try and get countries to work more closely together. One of the big problems that it had was that the United States was not a member. And the USA was becoming quite an important force in world politics by that stage. Even more important since the Second World War, of course, but already very important by the time of the end of the First World War. So the League of Nations was set up, but it didn't quite achieve what it set out to do, which was to avert a Second World War. You may remember earlier today we were talking about a guy called David Davis, Lord Davis of Llandinam, who established the Temple of Peace in Cardiff, and he founded the League of Nations Union. At the 1918 Eisteddfod, he issued the call to establish the League of Nations Union in Wales. And so he was a big advocate for countries working more closely together. He also said, Lord Davis, that we should have an international police force. That would effectively work to hold countries to account and would have powers over governments. That really obviously hasn't really come about. Governments don't like, apart from in very specific cases, being told what to do by forces that aren't within their control. So then we have the Second World War. And of course, what was the organisation then established after the Second World War to try and promote peace? I'm sure you all know this, or it's in the back of your minds somewhere. Someone shouted out. So. What was the organisation that came after the League of Nations? Well, the Warsaw Pact is an important part of the post-Second World War history, absolutely. But the organisation I'm thinking of, which was the successor to the League of Nations, was the United Nations, which of course is still around now. In the United Nations today, there are 193 member countries, and that is all of the independent countries in the world except one. The one that isn't is the Vatican, which is the smallest country in the world, and too small to have full membership of the UN. So almost every country in the world is a member of the United Nations, and they are very much about trying to ensure that countries cooperate, collaborate to ensure that people achieve equality, achieve better standards of healthcare and education, and all kinds of other things. An important aspect of what they do is peacekeeping. So if you ever see on the news footage peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers, you'll know them because they wear these very distinctive blue helmets with the UN emblem on them. And they are there to try and keep peace either between countries or within a country where they're called to do so. So the United Nations has been another important part of trying to achieve peace between countries. Finally, because Elizabeth talked about the European Union, which is so important, so I won't mention that again myself, but finally to mention the role of something you will definitely know about, which is NATO. Who was it who said they were from Newport area earlier? See, yeah, you'll no doubt have experienced the traffic delays, but NATO, of course, is far more important than than just the immediate concerns of that we all justifiably had at the time the summit was around. NATO is an expression of the wish to have something called collective security between countries. And collective security means countries clubbing together to guarantee each other's safety. And that's what NATO came out from. So the United Nations Charter says that countries are allowed to have collective security, and NATO is perhaps the most famous example of where this has happened. But of course, the NATO, in NATO, the countries guaranteeing each other's security, which are mostly countries in Europe, plus those in North America, that was all established to try and provide security against the threat at the time from Russia and other countries to the east of Europe. And so it's quite controversial. Some people believe that NATO has a real flaw, that its security is based fundamentally on nuclear weapons and on the power of the United States in particular, the military might to sort of exercise their will. It's been seen that obviously with Russia trying to make its mark in places like Ukraine, that possibly there's limited amount that NATO can do in some of these circumstances. But I just wanted to mention that, just to give you a sense, before we go on to Alid's part of this, that there are a number of attempts that are being made by countries to work together to try to ensure that war doesn't break out in the first place, and where it does, that they try to maintain peace as much as possible, collectively, internationally, rather than just leaving countries to get on with it. So finally, in this last of the three bits before we get on to what you can do yourselves, is to talk about the relevance of poverty and prejudice. So I'm pleased to welcome Alid Pickard from Christian Aid, who's going to be taking that one up.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. As you see, I work for Christian Aid yn Gweithio Cymru Snogol a blwyddyn nesaf. Bydd Snogol yn nodi ei benblwydd yn 70 oed. Next year, Christian Aid will be marking its birthday as 70 years old. And it's no coincidence. Is it not working? Shall I switch this? That's working much better. I can hear myself now as well. Yes, as I was trying to say, I work for Christian Aid. Next year, Christian Aid will be marking its 70th birthday. And it's no coincidence that it coincides with commemorations for the end of the Second World War, as Christian Aid was formed by British and Irish church leaders who were determined to do what they could at the end of the war to help European refugees who had lost everything following 6 years of fighting. And our aim then was Christian reconstruction in Europe, and our purpose was to alleviate the suffering for ordinary people, no matter what their faith. In 1952, Janet Lacey became president of the organisation, and bearing in mind that female leaders are still in the minority, Janet Lacey was a pioneer in many respects. Some thought her views too radical, but she was determined to make sure that we were working to combat poverty across the world. So we began to look beyond Europe and expanded our remit to support development work in newly independent nations in Africa and Asia, and respond to emergencies worldwide, for example, providing grants for Palestinian or Chinese and Korean refugees. We made sure that the public was aware of continuing problems in the world by organising the first Christian Aid Week in 1957. And in 1964, on the back of the success of Christian Aid Week, we changed our name to Christian Aid. And then as world food shortages increased, Christian Aid began to look more deeply into the causes of poverty, not just dealing with its symptoms. So we began campaigning in earnest when we challenged the British government on its aid and trade policies in 1969. Severe famines in Pakistan, Sudan and Ethiopia in the 1970s prompted a huge rise in public support for aid. And however, it was becoming obvious that emergency relief wasn't enough. What starving people needed was a genuine solution, not handouts. We saw that it was not just an act of nature that made people poor, but political and economic decisions. So alongside traditional relief and development, we started to consider how to work for people's rights. We worked in many of the world's hotspots in Vietnam and Laos, which had been destroyed by war, in Uganda following the overthrow of Idi Amin, in Nicaragua after the toppling of the dictator Somoza, and in Kampuchea, which is now Cambodia, after the fall of Pol Pot. By now, we were working in 40 countries, funding more than 100 long-term development projects. Then in the 1980s, there was a huge change in the way aid agencies operated. Large-scale fundraising events like Live Aid brought the troubles of the world to the public's attention as never before. And more people were giving, and for the first time, funding was made from government to support Christian Aid. And by the end of the decade, Christian Aid's annual income had increased from £5.5 million in 1979 to £28 million in 1989. But this extra funding was needed more than ever. Our director at the time, the Reverend Michael Taylor, he articulated our purpose in line with the times. He wrote that our aim was to strengthen the poor. He drove the creation of the Southern Africa Coalition, which brought together trade unions, church groups, and others to press the British government to end apartheid, which was a controversial and courageous act. In the 1990s, Christian Aid became one of the first aid agencies to highlight complex global economic issues. We campaigned to cancel Third World debt and exposed the culpability of the World Trade Organization and International Monetary Fund. So we were not afraid to confront governments and challenge the rules of the day that said charities should be apolitical. And this resolve helped change government trade policy and establish the Fair Trade Foundation. Our campaigning works. Christian Aid was also quick to respond to humanitarian crises and conflicts in Rwanda, the Middle East, and at the end of the decade working across ethnic and religious divides in Serbia, Bosnia and Kosovo. And as we neared the new millennium, we were able to announce that world leaders had promised to deliver $100 billion in debt relief after intense campaigning as part of the Jubilee 2000 coalition. And then in the 21st century, this has brought new challenges to Christian Aid. The so-called war on terror, climate change and the increasing number of natural disasters, and the fact that almost half the world's population live on less than $2 a day. All this means our work is needed more than ever. Last year, our income was £103.6 million, and we now work with more than 700 overseas partners in around 40 countries. We are putting into practice our aim of eradicating poverty. But almost 70 years on from our founding, the fact that we're still here is not a victory. Turning 70 is not a celebration. Looking back over our history, so much of our work has been dealing with war and conflict, or the aftermath of war. Violence is a major driver of poverty globally, bringing with it devastation, powerlessness, and chaos. Millions of people are imprisoned in poverty by conflict, violence, or the threat of violence. It is always disastrous to development. And the frustrations that come from living in poverty often leads to conflict. It's a vicious circle that can only be broken by tackling the causes of poverty. The world isn't getting any fairer. I'll see you again after the next war. Unbelievably, these are the words of a 5-year-old girl said to a Christian Aid member of staff as he was leaving Gaza a couple of weeks ago. I'll see you again after the next war. In Afghanistan, parents are selling their daughters in marriage to earn money so their family can survive a drought. The income of some multinational companies exceeds that of entire countries while they dodge billions of dollars in tax. More than 3 million people have become refugees as a result of the civil war in Syria, and this year an estimated 1.2 million Iraqis have been forced to leave their homes in fear for their lives from militants. So we won't stop now. We'll carry on tackling the causes of poverty. We'll continue to support local organisations to deliver real practical change, and we'll work so that everyone can fulfil their right to a decent life.